Sergo, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I am John Kane. Look, I want to talk about Martin Luther King because of Martin Luther King Day, in the wake of Martin Luther King Day anyway. I don't know how often Native people, get into the conversation about MLK and what he represented and what history has done to him, because this is part of what I consider a bit of a whitewashing that that happens with not just with historical figures, but just plain with history. And it's amazing to me now when you hear people, white people in particular, talk about how beloved Martin Luther King was and everything else, because he wasn't beloved by by white people. I'm not saying white people weren't hearing him; they were, and I'm not saying he didn't move some of them, but when you look in retrospect, there's like this constant effort to cast Martin Luther King as this loving, peaceful protester who just happened to get assassinated. I mean, his message oftentimes gets watered down. There are certain speeches that you're going to hear over and over again. I Have a Dream speech. It's inspiring and all that. But some of the pieces of that speech that have kind of the edges to it, the one that says I might not get there, they seem to get overshadowed by this idea of having lofty dreams. But that wasn't. Look, that's not his. That doesn't accurately define him. One speech, he became very, very active in the anti-war movement. Condemning the military-industrial complex. He was very outspoken about that. He was outspoken against the sins and the ills of capitalism, and of course, he spoke about racism, and not in just these plutonic terms either. I mean, he was very outspoken about the cruel injustices that are caused by militarism, by capitalism, and by racism. And and how he started what are still a movement called or a re-energized movement called the Poor People's Campaign. He knew the violence of poverty, and how that poverty was tied so closely to racism. And so he spoke out about these things, and his words were strong, and he called for action. He wasn't just, he wasn't telling people to just get on their knees and pray. And I'm not, people won't, whether anybody really says that or not. I mean, he identified what the real problems were, that it wasn't just the extremes. It was the people in the middle. In fact, I'm not going to read a whole lot of Martin Luther King quotes, but this is one that, frankly, I just used in a letter that I sent off to Cambridge Central School Board of Education, because of their hesitancy to upset the community as they deal with the mascot issue and that kind of stuff. So. But let me read this one because it's pretty good. And it speaks to what he really did condemn. And he says, I first must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizens councilors or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace which is absent of tension to a positive peace which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goals you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. You know, we oftentimes hear this, you know, and look, the justice delayed is justice denied quote is not his, but that's essentially the message. You keep putting off fixing what you know is wrong, and even goals that you're going to say you agree with. And this is kind of what I went through, what I'm still going through with you know the school board of my old high school. It's clear that everybody agrees that the things have to change, but can we do it so we don't cause tension? And this is what Dr. King condemned. He condemned it because those people who would try to soften the blow of change were delaying the change, and in doing it, in doing so, you are prolonging the agony of people. And right along along those lines, it's not just a pain that we all suffer. Some people die at the hands of this stuff. And I think it's really important that people understand that this is what Dr. King condemned. And I don't think it's a leap to suggest that he would be very condemning of the white moderate that exists today. And not just the white moderate, because let's face it, the white moderate has allies, and they're people of color. We've seen, we've seen black people who've somehow risen to the level of white people. It doesn't mean that there's equality. It means that we've seen some black people who can sit at the table with white people, and they have that conversation that the white people want to have, and I'll say the same thing about Native people. I don't think that Dr. King would relish this idea of that Native people are embracing the American system, or let alone enlisting at the levels that we've always enlisted in the armed forces. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that King would condemn. Although the military-industrial complex is more about the industry than it is about enlisting in the services. But they need feet on the ground, boots on the ground, they say, right? And when it's people of color that are providing those boots on the ground, you got to wonder, are King's messages resonating? So as I look at white moderates, black moderates, Native moderates, the ones, and again, I'm including people like Deb Haaland in this group. Whose bidding is going to be done here? Are we really giving power to the voices of the unheard? Are we really giving power to that? Or are we plucking people out of those groups to somehow soften the message? And that was Dr. King's concern. Look, when he's condemning capitalism, he's condemning, essentially a modern day version of slavery. Not just with consumerism, but the haves and the have-nots between labor and management, between labor and ownership of all these corporations. Look, and when I hear people say today, well, but there's things are pretty equal. I mean, I got into a discussion the other day with somebody who was suggesting that women's equality has been achieved. By what measure? By what measure? You walk into the halls of Congress, you don't see 50% of the people in the House or the Senate that are women. Half the population are women. You don't see women, the average income of a woman coming anywhere near the average income of a man. And yet you're still going to have people insist this. And and maybe they're talking because they feel like they haven't achieved something as individuals. But inequality is a huge problem, and worse than the inequality that can be measured, across genders, is the inequality that it becomes even, further emphasized when you're talking about people of color. Because look, if you're a woman and you're oppressed, if you're a black woman, you're more oppressed. If you're a woman and you're oppressed, if you're a Native woman, you are more oppressed. I mean, sexual violence is still, look, who are the victims of sexual violence? Children and women. I mean, white men are rarely ever the victims of this kind of thing. They're very often the perpetrators, whether they're, wearing a clergy's outfit or whether they, are movie producers or politicians. But I think it's important when talking about Dr. King that we don't soften, or whitewash, and I don't even say whitewash because although it's white people doing it, is soften his message. I mean, he was a guy who was promoting radical change. He wasn't just preaching a kumbaya moment. I mean, the direct action that he talked about, what were actions. They weren't just sit-ins. I'm not saying that he was, calling for armed insurrection, but he also knew that peaceful protests weren't getting it done, not by themselves. And as he approached his last days, he knew the violence that was lurking for anybody, and not just himself, but the violence that was lurking there for anybody that was changing the status quo, which is what he was doing. Now, look, I know people like to put a timestamp specifically on Martin Luther King on when he was saying the most broadly accepted kind of messages, the ones that talked about peace and love and and the long arc of morality, and having a dream. That's people love that stuff. But he also understood that when people lash out, there's a reason they do it. I mean, his quote that riot is the language of the unheard wasn't a call to riot as much as it was an understanding of why riots exist. Now, don't confuse what took place at the U.S. Capitol with that riot was the language of the herd, and I mean HERD, not the HERD. That's a completely different different display of of action or violence or whatever else. And the fact that people want to compare, the quote unquote riots associated with the Black Lives Matter movement and the riot at the Capitol, clearly demonstrate the racial bias, because whatever those protests in the street developed into, they began as a direct action against injustice. Not a direct action against a conspiracy theory or a loyalty to a specific individual. Sure, they said her name. They said Breonna Taylor. They said George Floyd. They said Freddie Gray. They said all the names. But those people are gone. That's why they said their names. That's why they were on the street. And the fact that they were met with violence, and violence bred more violence, and so when we talk about the riots that were caused, we can debate who caused them, but there is no debate why those riots occurred in the first place, why those people were there. They were protesting injustice. Now, I understand that the mentality of those folks who stormed the Capitol last week believed, some of them, that somehow Donald Trump's second term was stolen from him. But they were there under the misguided belief that their leader was calling them there. Well, he was calling them, but that the leader, that somehow they're going there was going to change the outcome. Well, people go down, go to the street for a Black Lives Matter, rally or march or whatever else. It's demanding a change, not supporting, an authoritarian leader. Those things don't even compare. And I think it's really important that people understand, especially when, look, they name a holiday after Martin Luther King, and the mainstream media, and look, Dr. King was a preacher. He was a reverend. So many people are going to try to, use religion and Jesus love and all kinds of other stuff to tailor King's message for their own agenda. And look, perhaps I'm doing a little of it myself, but I'm not going to soften his words. Look, you can find all kinds of King speeches in text and in on videos, recordings. You can find and listen to them yourselves. But don't just get hung up on the most famous speeches. I mean, again, letters from Birmingham, that's 1963. That's not 68 when he was killed. But you also have to remember that he was killed. He was murdered, and the circumstances surrounding that murder, in terms of the debacle associated with the investigation and everything leading up to it, there was an effort to silence King, as before they finally did. And of course, we could argue whether they really silenced him or not, because many of his words are still ringing. But I think it's really important that people understand that his message was not the soft tones that that the overwhelming white majority will attribute to them now. Look, and there's no question that there are still many white Americans who loathe Dr. King, who just look for the opportunity to slam or condemn him. I saw some of these ridiculous posts on social media today and yesterday, and leading up to the MLK Day, and it's just amazing how much hate and vitriol are still being directed towards a man who was killed that many years ago, and of course, it's not just directed towards him. It's directed towards Black Lives Matter. It's directed towards people of color, regardless of what their actual voices are saying. This new guy who was just elected in Georgia is actually he's a reverend. He's a preacher in the very church that MLK was. It was his church, and. Again, the hate that is coming from, not just these Trumpers, but many people on the right, these white supremacist groups, this QAnon stuff. Look, the amount, of just flat out lies that are put out there, and especially the thing that QAnon is so famous for is the whole pedophilia thing. The first thing they're going to do to anybody that they want to condemn is call them a pedophile, and accuse them, groundlessly or otherwise, of any kind of act, atrocious act with a child. And you can you can see that on cue. I didn't mean that. That's a pun. But no, it is, and I've seen that all of those allegations being directed towards MLK this week. That's the level of hate that still exists. And it's part of the reason that you have to believe that Dr. King spoke so strongly out against the moderates. Because it's the moderates who allow this stuff. This is the complicity, right? This is the idea of being silent. And look, you are either a racist or an anti-racist. Because when people say, "Oh, I'm not racist," that's, if you dig into that with almost anybody, And they throw the whole, oh, I've got a black friend, or, I'm part this or I'm part that or something like that. When you dig into it, and the most of you who say that I'm not a racist they're certainly not anti-racist, because they won't stand up to racism. And if you're not standing up to racism, if you're not standing up against racism, then you are complicit with racism. And so let's not pull any punches on this one here. And racism, when people call racism America's original sin, I think that's accurate. I'm sometimes a little troubled when they say slavery was America's original sin. No, racism was. Because racism is what would lie at the foundation of both genocide of Native people, slavery, both Native people who were enslaved and black people who were enslaved. The idea of building an entire industry. I mean, think about this thing. Dr. King is talking about, capitalism 100 years after slavery was supposed to have ended. But 100 years prior to his words about capitalism, one of the biggest, what essentially equaled the largest assets, industrial assets of the United States, was human slavery. Human beings. If you measured the wealth of a farmer, a plantation owner, whatever, those who are affluent, the industry of slavery, the buying and selling, the breeding in captivity of slaves, was one of the biggest industries in the United States in the 1860s. And that just didn't switch off when slavery was made illegal. No. Every opportunity that a free black person strove for and attained came with a tremendous cost. And oftentimes, not only were the obstacles incredible to achieve any success, but that success would be stripped away anyway, whether you're talking about Tulsa. And look, every major city in the United States, most major cities in the United States, in that period of time at the turn of the century, had experienced what many will call race riots, but they were massacres. I mean, so when you come at the heels of Native people being massacred, the last one, acknowledged being the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, within a decade, you would start to see these massive, again, riots, but massacres of black people. New York, Philadelphia, Tulsa, Chicago, every major city that had a significant black population, at some point in that period between 1900 and 1920, would experience some tremendous backlash. And look, they always try to bring those massacres, those events down to some black man being accused of doing something to a white woman or something along those lines. But that's not what precipitated this stuff. It could be a simple thing. It could be a simple thing that would have caused those lynch mobs. I mean, it could be, not stepping off the curb for a white person. It could be just giving the appearance to a white person that somehow you'd gotten too uppity. And that word all by itself conjures up images of a white person condemning a black person. Uppity. So, I mean, I think it's really important that not just on this day, but anytime a conversation comes up about Martin Luther King, it's important that people don't lose focus and don't buy into the watered down narrative that he was just a kind, loving. Look, you see the man and all the images and all the photos and everything else, and he's got a benevolent look to him. I mean, he doesn't look for all the world that the anger existed in him. But make no mistake about it, he was angered. He was angered by moderates that would tell people to be patient and wait for your season. But he was also angry at the violence of poverty, the violence of hunger, the violence of racism, and again, the violence of the military-industrial complex. There were wars being fought because they had the weapons and they had the men to fight them, not because they were necessary. I mean, I ask family members that I have, do you know why you went to Vietnam? And they don't. They don't. Regardless of what they did there, and I have, some people who are pretty close to me who took lives in Vietnam. And for the life of themselves, they can't tell you why. They know why. They know they were told to do it. It's kind of like these guys who came to the Capitol, U.S. Capitol last week. They know they were told to do it. But this is, look, this is really what King was condemning. He was condemning the military-industrial complex and the violence associated. I mean, look, clearly he was against the Vietnam War. But it was bigger than just the idea of the Vietnam War. I mean, and look, think about it now. I mean, when you think about wars being waged to stop communism, to stop an ideology. See, now everything's always talking about trying to stop terrorism, where there's not even, it's hard to even wrap your hands around who the enemy is. But in Korea and in Vietnam, and in military actions, every place from South and Central America to other places around the world, there was a real effort to kill a political system that the United States simply didn't agree with. That was grounds for killing people. Now, look, I'm not saying that every system of government doesn't have its evil masterminds behind it, whether it's communism, whether it's a U.S. democracy, because it does. Look, there are people, and look, even so-called democracies, and this last 4 years can prove that, can produce authoritarian leaders, and does produce authoritarian leaders. And the United States picks and chooses who are the good ones and who are the bad ones. And look, it doesn't even have to be democracies for the United States to embrace some of these authoritarian leaders, the ones that kill their own people, that suppress, any kind of dissenting thought. And this was what King condemned. He condemned the United States building up to be essentially what is now, the single most powerful military complex in the world. And look, I'm sure China and Russia will try to debate some of that, but I mean, I think people, Americans take pride. The very thing that King condemned, the vast majority of Americans are proud that the United States is this huge military power. All right, hey, we're at the bottom of the hour. We'll take a break and we'll come right back. I want to kick this a little bit more, so we'll do it when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. It's interesting because when MLK Day arrives and we start to pay particular interest in his words, in some of what he wrote, in some of what he spoke, and that kind of stuff, and you put it into today's context. I mean, like I said, I used that excerpt from his letter from Birmingham in an email to the my high school, my old high school's board of education, and part of it is it resonated so strongly with me because I get the sense that they're trying to keep the community from becoming divisive over the issue, which is impossible. I mean, you can't have a debate over a race-based mascot that's existed for this long. I mean, keep in mind, 20 years ago, so in 2001, and it'll be 20 years this year, the state gave a directive to high schools, to schools, and said, look, if you've got them, you've got to move towards removing them in a practicable time. You've got to get rid of them, and that's what they said. They didn't say give a deadline. They said they had to do it in what would be a practical period of time. That was 20 years ago. Now, in 2001, a bunch of schools did change them. Almost immediately, and of course we've seen over the years, schools and the NCAA has done a lot to to end the use of native race-based, but specifically native mascots. But New York State told the schools specifically, and all your conversation about honoring Native people don't feel honored. I mean, the state told the schools this. They told them what we told them, that no, we are not honored by schools using native mascots. So 20 years later, there are schools that are still dug in, and of course, most of them just buried it. They felt like they dodged a bullet 20 years ago, so they didn't use their time to massage the community and prepare them for a change, if that was even doable. So when I go back to my old high school and raise some hell about it and say, look, I graduated from here. And while I was not mistreated as a Native person, this practice is racist. I'm not calling you all racists, but if you want to keep defending it, if you want to keep prolonging, you've kicked it for 20 years since the state told you to change it. So when I hear, when I reread, again, it's unfortunate that many of us only read, some of King's work, once a year. But as I read this, and I'm thinking, this, when he's condemning the white moderates, look, Cambridge is white people. I'm not saying there aren't a few people of color there. I think, but I think it was like 93 or something like 94% white. And I think the Native people represented like 1/10 of 1% or something like that, or something, some minuscule amount. So the few people of color there, look, they're just trying to get along, and they're not outspoken. The outspoken people in Cambridge are white people. And those are the people who are striving for social justice issues and asking for racial equity trainings in the schools and that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying there's not a few people of color involved in them, but if you've gotten comfortable in a community, and especially if you moved there and you're not from there originally, and you've been able to establish relationships amongst the predominantly white community, you're not going to disrupt that. I mean, some will. Some will be, bold enough to do that, but many won't. So when I read the letter from Birmingham and I see the, King's harsh comments about, the biggest obstacle, the biggest stumbling block to freedom, it's not the white supremacists. It's not the Klan members. It's not these white citizens councils. No, it's the moderates. It's the ones who are just saying, be patient. We're going to come up with a way. Look, we know we have to change the mascot. We know that it's racist, but we don't want to tear the community apart. And what's King's comment? You want to delay this thing because you're more concerned about the tensions that exist or that may arise in the pursuit of justice. You're more concerned about order than justice. Well, look, even the people who I feel strongly about on the school board in my old high school, who I know if they had to vote today, would vote to end the mask. Even the people that I think are on our side, they're really, really concerned about the dissension in the community. And look, King's comment was that he was concerned about the white moderates who are more concerned about order than justice. I'm not saying that order doesn't, trying to maintain peace doesn't have value. But you can't be so committed to maintaining peace, or the absence of tension, as King calls it, that you allow injustice to continue. So this is when I get jazzed up. When I realize that the thoughts that are coming into my mind based on the circumstances today are not new. And John Lennon suggested, there's nothing you can do that hasn't been done, right? The question is, where do you take the next step? And I think, without trying to turn away the white moderates, we have to tell them that their behavior is unacceptable, and that their behavior. Look, I can deal with the overt racists. Like I said, I've said it before here on the show. The guy who's got the Trump flags hanging up there and the Confederate flags hanging off of his tree, I can avoid that person. And I know that person is probably not going to have a whole lot of influence over him, because if he does do something like, becomes a person of influence in a community, some of that stuff can be held against them. So, but it's the moderates. It's the ones who are so concerned about their station in life, their standing in a community, that they don't tell you how they really feel. It just kind of slips out every once in a while. So they'll give you the impression that, oh yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, but we can't deal with it that way. So they'll give you 1,000 reasons why you don't confront an injustice. And none of those reasons are because it's just. They'll say, no, yeah, but it's always been like this, so it's hard to change. Look, that's the argument. We get that for a lot of things. I'm not just talking about mascots here. We hear this all the time. But and the fact of the matter is that racism is still one of the driving forces behind inequities in the United States. Slavery was ended in the 1860s. And yet racism still is the driving force behind it, behind the inequities. And everything from the income disparity, poverty, housing, opportunities, work, employment, all of that stuff. Like I said, if you don't think that there's gender inequality, you just do a roll call of the House of Representatives and the Senate. If you don't think that race and racism is a driving force, then do a roll call of the people in the House of Representatives or the Senate. Pick up your color chart, hold it up to the faces if that's what you got to do. Because that's going to give you a pretty good indication. And it's not just here. I've mentioned this before. I was appalled when I realized how white the parliament of Brazil was. A country that's predominantly black and brown, but their parliament's not. And in all of these countries, especially when you see the United States, when their disposition towards a leader of especially in South America, they're always going to be more accommodating to those who are educated in the United States, those who have a lighter complexion, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in Bolivia, no matter where it's at, Mexico. The whiter those leaders are, and the more affinity they've shown towards the United States, the more the United States will do what they can, and everything from coup attempts, sanctions, everything, whatever they've got to do to support those kinds of leaders. It doesn't matter how authoritarian they are. In fact, the more authoritarian, the better, as far as the United States is concerned, because they look at authoritarian leaders in other countries as stability, and that goes for the Middle East. And it goes for South America, or Europe and Africa too. Why leave anybody out? And And again, when you consider the omnipresence of the United States military every place, the very thing that King condemned. I mean, look, King could, I don't even know if he could have anticipated how omnipresent the United States military would be. I mean, he was speaking in the 1960s. What the United States military has grown into now, the number of countries that have U.S. military bases with troops on the ground there, the military presence in over 70 other countries, I think it is. I mean, it's rather incredible. Any other country that would have spread its military around the globe the way the United States does, the United States would have called that aggression. But because it's the United States, everybody says, "Oh, the United States is only goodness. They're white is right." So this is, and this is why Americans believe that they can do no evil and they can do no wrong. It's they think nothing of having military bases in countries that don't want you there, including Cuba. I mean, and so this is that the very military industrial complex that Dr. King spoke out against. Donald Trump literally said, and I know it's a quote because I heard the words. It wasn't just written someplace. He said, if you're not going to use them, what's the sense of having them? And he was referring to nuclear weapons. I mean, and the crazy part is this is the guy who will brag now about being the only president in recent memory that did not engage, did not start a war. Well, I'll give him that. But this kind of, part of the reason, maybe because people thought he was just so crazy that, that there was an avoidance to the military conflict. Now, don't get me wrong. There were still plenty of people being killed by Americans during Trump's administration, including an assassination of a military leader, of Iran. So, I mean, yeah, there may not have been any added new wars, as they say, but every president of the United States has used their military-industrial complex to further national interests, including killing people and innocent people. Look, Barack Obama, famous for the drone strike. He killed more people, in the same manner as a video game than any president in history, including Donald Trump. Of course, he had 8 years to do it. But there's blood on every one of these guys' hands. And this is why King was so opposed to it. He was opposed to this idea that the United States had carte blanche to kill people. And clearly they do. I mean, the assassination of the military leader from Iran that Trump still brags about. Why did he do it? Because he could. And there was no real cost to him. This becomes one of his bragging points. If anything, he gained some he gained even more support from places like Israel. But this is and that's why the military was such a condemnable feature of the United States to somebody like Dr. King. And again, capitalism. I along with a few other Native people, we begun participating in the Poor People's Campaign. And there's actually, although Native people kind of rejected some of that, not during King's efforts, but in efforts after King, because of the way it was managed. Native people now in various places have stepped up, and so we have like a Native contingent of the Poor People's Campaign. I participated in a couple of events. I'm still, I still get concerned about how poverty is addressed, and of course the solution to poverty isn't just money. I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, but that's true. We do need resources to address poverty. There's no question about that. But there has to be there has to be systemic changes. You know, poverty just didn't happen to black and brown people. The poverty was created. It was created by policy. Native people knew we knew how to take care of ourselves. We knew how to sustain ourselves until all of those means for sustenance were taken away. In land especially. But we became, there was an effort to make us wards of the state. In fact, there's, Paul Gozer, one of his famous quotes from a couple of years ago, a Republican congressman, said, Native people are wards of the state. They tried to make us wards of the state, just like they tried to force us into U.S. citizenship. And by creating, an unsustainable existence on our territories, then you get the nerve to hear some of these politicians say, well, the worst thing we ever did was allow the establishment of reservations. For one thing, these are the small parcels of land that we managed to hang on to during the land theft and centuries of land theft from Native people. And so when the United States says they created these environments for us, well, you created the policies that made our existence unsustainable. And it's not just us. I mean, it's the same thing that exists in inner cities for urban populations. And look, there's a lot of poor white people in the South and in other places. And again, in every urban environment, there's a lot of white people who are living well below the poverty line too. But as much as they're dismissed and ignored by the powers that be, they still hang on to this idea of whiteness, believing that they're just 1 ounce of dumb luck away from being successful, even in the eyes of other white people. But capitalism is the ugly beast that has created so much of this, this inequity. And look, the United States brags about democracy and they brag about free market. And I've talked about this on a previous show. But neither one of those things, do anything for poor people. Yeah, and so the whole systems are geared towards making the rich richer. And who do they get rich on the backs of? Cheap, unsustainable labor and consumerism. We not only give them the sweat to produce for them, we give them the hard-earned dollars we made for that sweat. We turn around and give it right back to them for the crap they got us making. I mean, that's capitalism. That's the free market that is so directly connected to this American ideal, this American idea of democracy. Democracy is freedom. Capitalism is freedom. No, it isn't. And I've said it before. Democracy is majority rule. And it's who within that majority will rule. So if the majority is white, it's going to be white people ruling stuff. And those white people are also the people who are not just ruling the country, they're ruling the economy, they're ruling the information technology, all of it. King had no idea. Man, he would have had a field day with information technology, not just media. His life, was only begun to be captured by media in the 60s. But to see how racism and conspiracy theory and false narratives associated with everything that is condemnable in the United States, including racism, capitalism, and militarism. I mean, look, every major news network falls over themselves on Veterans Day and Memorial Day and all of these, these holidays that are meant to romanticize war, death, and destruction. Hollywood loves it. Greatest blockbuster films are always involve massive amount of death. And, look, and a lot of it's historical in nature, and it's romanticized in the telling of history. And when they get done telling that story, they'll make up new conflicts for the future. But again, this idea that we all become bit players in both capitalism and the military industrial complex. Look, Native people enlist in the military at a higher rate than any other people in the United States. As a rate, I'm talking. There's still more white people in the military than people of color, but the enlistment rate against Native people is really high compared to everybody else. Black people too. I mean, and so why is that? What drives a Native person to want to enlist in the military, or a person of color? And don't give me this warrior mentality or legacy or whatever else. It's poverty. It's the lack of opportunity. And look, that's how it's marketed on television, radio, all of that stuff. They market this idea that you're going to see the world. Army of one. They romanticize it to get you in, and then you're used. And like as I was saying in the first half hour, when you really get used, and when I say used, I mean not just as personnel, but in terms of pulling the trigger. Whether you're playing joysticks and killing people with a drone, or whether you're boots on the ground, I don't know how people reconcile that, and maybe it's better they don't. But unfortunately, this all adds to some of what I always refer to as cognitive dissonance. Look, man is the only species that kills for vengeance, or out of, that doesn't kill purely out of necessity. Now, I'm not saying that other animals don't kill each other, and oftentimes it's about food, or defending their their young and that kind of stuff. But man's the only species that kills out of vengeance and kills specifically for financial gain. And to be clear here, wars are fought over national interests. Almost all of those national interests are driven by money. They're driven by resources. That's why wars are fought. All of the Middle Eastern conflicts, it's not a stretch to call them the oil wars. And a lot of the death and destruction that Native people experienced, that was all over taking land, resources, gold rush, all that stuff. We were killed for profit and for profiteering. That's what Native people were killed for. And you don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get there. I mean, call it what it is. We were killed for profit. Sometimes we were killed for a bounty for our scalps. But the reason that those deaths were willed upon us was to take our land, to take our resources. And it's the same driving force behind conflicts today. It's about national interest. But the average person who enlists, Native, Black, brown, white, they don't know why somebody is their enemy. They're told who the enemy is. They're used, and they're used up. And I'll tell you, it doesn't take, you don't have to look too deeply to see how poorly veterans have been treated, especially veterans of foreign wars, the ones who are carrying the guilt and the PTSD and that cognitive dissonance. They don't get the help they needed. That's why suicide rates amongst veterans and homeless rates are among the highest in the United States. Why? Because that is the military-industrial complex. I mean, it's an engine that brings in raw material and spits out refuse. So who is the refuse? It's not just the dead, it's the living. It's the casualties of war. And those casualties of war aren't just the ones who were shot. the casualties of those wars are the ones who have been used and used up. That is what Martin Luther King spoke out against. Again, the three enemies that he identified: militarism, capitalism, and racism. And the fact that we are still fighting that fight and frankly, losing some of these battles. Capitalism is bigger than it ever was, bigger than King's time. Militarism is bigger than King's time. We can argue about whether racism is or not. And I don't think we've won that war either. So that long arc of morality, it might bend towards justice, but there's a term in, I think in math called isotope or something like that. It refers to two lines that are approaching each other, but they never touch. I don't know that arc of morality ever reaches justice or not. Nice thought. And I think we got to keep trying to bend that, keep that arc moving that way. I guess we'll see if we get there. I want to thank you for listening. I wish you a belated happy MLK Day. We'll see you next time. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.